My son yelled, "Shut up, old man!" At our gala, he didn't know I was the guest of honor. The night of my retirement party, the crystal chandeliers glowing and the soft jazz playing, I believed this was my moment, or so my son said. Then, in front of all the guests and the billionaire CEO he was trying to impress, he turned around and said, "Shut up, old man, you don't belong here." The room fell silent, the wine glass stopped in midair, and I stood there, not shedding a tear. I just smiled. Before you decide who belongs here, ask Mr. Sterling who laid the groundwork for tonight. The smile on his face faded, because the man he wanted to conquer walked right past my son, took my hand, and said, "It's an honor to finally meet you. Before I tell you the rest, stay, because the end of that night changed an entire family." I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? Arthur Vance had never been inside the Willow Lounge before. The doorman, dressed in black with a tiny gold pin that read "Private Event," had greeted him by name, clearly briefed in advance, and held open the glass door with the same mechanical smile he probably used on senators and tech billionaires. Inside, everything shimmered, the kind of light that made people look expensive. Champagne flutes glittering under chandeliers, waiters gliding in tailored black vests, laughter echoing like polished silver. Arthur paused at the threshold, smoothing the lapel of his charcoal suit. It was one of his best Brooks Brothers, purchased 15 years ago, but surrounded by designer tuxedos and glittering cocktail dresses, he felt like a page from an older book someone had mistakenly inserted into a new edition. He tugged once at his tie, the bright navy one Leo had mailed him last week. "Wear this, Dad, it'll pop in photos." It certainly popped, like a sore thumb. He found his son across the room almost immediately. Leo was magnetic in that way some people are when they know they're being watched. His gestures were expansive, confident, rehearsed. He wore his ambition like cologne strong enough that even from across the room, Arthur could almost smell it. He lingered near the bar, unsure of what to do with his hands. His wife, Ellen, would have known she'd have ordered him a drink, whispered who's who, nudged him forward with that gentle, unstoppable confidence she had. But Ellen was gone 3 years now, and Leo, for all his promises to check in, seemed to orbit a different planet altogether. 2 weeks earlier, Leo had called from his office, voice bright, almost rehearsed. "Dad, it's a big night for me. I've been nominated for Under 40 Visionaries by Business Forward. We're hosting the party at the Willow Lounge Mr. Sterling's attending. Your presence would lend some gravitas." Arthur had chuckled softly. "You make it sound like I'm a decorative antique." Leo laughed, too quickly. "Come on, Dad. You are the reason I ever cared about business. Besides, people still talk about Vance Industrial. It'd mean a lot if you were there." So Arthur said yes, because that's what you do when your only son asks. You show up, even when you're not sure where you fit anymore. Now, under the chandeliers, Arthur realized how foreign this world was. Jazz hummed softly beneath the chatter. A photographer drifted between groups like a honeybee, capturing smiles that didn't quite reach eyes. A young woman laughed too loudly at something Leo said, resting a manicured hand on his arm. Arthur stood quietly, the smile on his face practiced, polite. He watched Leo's body language, the way his son's shoulders angled toward investors, the subtle shift of posture when someone important approached. He noticed the way Leo's laughter sharpened when Mr. Sterling came near. When Leo finally spotted him, it was with a flash of recognition that felt half obligation. "Dad, you made it!" Arthur smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." Leo clapped a hand on his father's shoulder, perfunctory, almost managerial. "Grab a drink, will you? I've got to catch Mr. Sterling before he disappears." And then he was gone, sliding through the crowd like a man who had trained for this moment his entire life. Arthur stood there a moment longer, still smiling even after Leo disappeared. A waiter offered him champagne. He shook his head gently. "I'll just hold on to the glass. Looks like everyone else is." He drifted along the edges of conversations, the way one does when they're both present and invisible. People laughed about things he didn't understand, startups, seed rounds, exit strategies. Every so often someone would nod at him politely, unsure if he was a guest or part of the staff. Near the piano, he caught Leo's voice, smooth, confident. A group of men and women surrounded him, their laughter the practiced kind that comes from networking rather than joy. Someone asked, "So Leo, your dad's company that was manufacturing, right?" Arthur turned slightly, pretending to look elsewhere. Leo laughed, light and dismissive. "Yeah, dad's old company. It was a nice little venture. Kind of quaint, you know. He sold it when he retired. Comfortable enough, but I'm aiming for something with a bit more global impact." The group laughed. Someone said, "Well, you've certainly outgrown the old model." Leo smiled modestly, sipping his drink. Arthur felt the words like fine cracks forming beneath his ribs. A nice little venture. The company that had fed their family, employed 40 people for 2 decades, survived recessions. The company where Leo had once drawn his first business plan on a napkin beside him, in the same office that smelled of oil and ambition. He thought of the nights they'd stayed up together, calculating risks, teaching Leo how to read profit sheets. Comfortable retirement, Leo said, as though legacy were a quaint inconvenience to be rebranded. Arthur stepped back, steadying himself. He took in the room, the laughter, the hum of wealth, and realized how far the distance between father and son had grown. Not miles, but values. He found himself at the bar again, this time beside a man about his age who wore his wealth more quietly, a plain navy suit, no watch that shouted, "Your first time at one of these?" the man asked, smiling kindly. Arthur nodded. "And probably my last." The man chuckled. "Same here. My daughter's in marketing. Every time she invites me, I feel like I should have brought a resume." Arthur smiled faintly. "My son's hosting. He's the tall one with the perfect posture." The man followed his gaze. "Ah, impressive kid." Arthur didn't answer. He just watched Leo leaning in close to Mr. Sterling now. Laughter precise, tone deferential. There was hunger in his eyes, not for the conversation, but for what it represented. The bartender came over. "Can't get you anything, sir?" Arthur shook his head. "No, thank you. Just keeping an eye on things." He stayed there as the crowd thinned and the music softened. Leo never looked his way again. For the first time that night, Arthur stopped trying to smile. He let the stillness settle around him like a coat. Across the room, his son's laughter rang out again, bright, confident, utterly foreign. He remembered teaching Leo how to tie that first Windsor knot, the way the boy had looked in the mirror, beaming with pride. Now, the same knot hung from a $1,000 suit and the face Arthur could hardly recognize. He had come tonight to lend gravitas. But standing there, under chandeliers that reflected only other people's ambitions, Arthur realized he had become something else, entirely an accessory in a life he no longer understood. When the applause rose for Leo's speech, Arthur clapped politely, hands steady, heart quiet. He didn't stay to say goodbye. Instead, he lingered by the doorway, watching Leo shake hands with Mr. Sterling, a man whose approval carried more weight than a father's pride ever could. And as the laughter swelled, Arthur finally saw the truth beneath the glittering surface. His son wasn't hosting a celebration. He was performing a play, and Arthur, for the first time, knew he was only the audience. The band had shifted to something quieter now, a low saxophone drifting between conversations like smoke. Arthur stood near the bar, pretending to read the wine list, though he'd long since stopped seeing the words. Across the room, Leo was closing in on Alistair Sterling, the man everyone here seemed to orbit. Sterling was older than Arthur, perhaps mid-70s, silver-haired, clean-shaven, dressed in an open-collar shirt that somehow made him look more powerful than all the men in tuxedos combined. When he moved, people parted. Leo approached with the energy of a man about to pitch his entire soul. Arthur knew that look, the faint, eager tilt of Leo's head, the overconfident smile that showed one too many teeth. He'd seen it before back when Leo was still borrowing Arthur's briefcase for high school debates. Desperate to impress, terrified to lose, but this wasn't high school anymore. This was something closer to hunting season. Sterling turned slightly, as if already aware of being approached. Leo extended a hand, his voice smooth and confident. Arthur could only catch fragments over the music and the hum of conversation. "Mr. Sterling, I've been wanting to meet you for years. I've admired your work at Axion Labs. Sterling nodded politely, his expression unreadable. Then Leo's voice rose just enough to carry. What my father's generation built was foundational, of course, brick and mortar thinking. My project, Nexus, is the evolution of that. It takes his humble beginnings and launches them into the stratosphere. I built this from the ground up, with nothing but a vision. Arthur felt the words slide into him like thin knives. Nothing but a vision. He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had once held a pen steady over a retirement account withdrawal form. He could still feel the weight of that pen, its cold barrel pressing into his fingers as Leo had stood behind him, watching the numbers on the screen change. $500,000, Dad. Just a loan. You'll be a partner, I promise. He had believed him. Arthur's mind drifted to that afternoon 3 years ago, the kitchen table covered in coffee mugs, Leo's laptop open to a blurry slideshow about disrupting global logistics. Leo's voice had been hoarse from excitement, his tie loosened, his eyes wild with conviction. Dad, this is it, the next big thing. I just need seed money to get us off the ground. No one else will trust a guy without capital, but once they see your name on the paperwork, they'll line up. Backs to delusion. Arthur had hesitated, staring at the balance in his retirement fund. It was supposed to last him the rest of his life. But Leo's faith, that reckless, beautiful faith, reminded him of his own youth, the years when he built Vance Industrial from an empty garage and a blueprint. And so, against every rational bone in his body, he'd done it. He signed the transfer, watched the zeros vanish, and told himself it wasn't a loss, it was love, rebranded as investment. Now, standing under the chandelier's glow, he watched that same love rewritten as a prop in his son's monologue. Leo spoke with practiced rhythm, his hand gestures fluid, his voice calibrated for admiration. Sterling listened, but not warmly. Arthur noticed the man's expression, a small, patient smile, the kind a teacher gives to a student who's talking too much. Around them, a few guests exchanged glances. A woman in a sequin dress hid a smirk behind her glass. A man whispered something to his companion, both of them turning slightly to watch. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a performance, and the audience was judging. Arthur's anger didn't flare. It cooled, the way certain metals strengthen when exposed to flame and time. He realized this was a version of his son the world saw, confident, charming, self-made, and how easily they might believe him. How easily he had once believed him too. He closed his eyes for a moment, and another memory rose uninvited. Leo calling at midnight, his voice raw with exhaustion. Dad, it's falling apart. Investors are backing out. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Arthur had stayed on the phone for 2 hours, talking him down from despair. You're fine, he said softly. Failures are blueprints. You adjust and rebuild. Leo hadn't really listened. He needed comfort, not advice. But Arthur had hung up that night, feeling proud, even grateful to be needed. Now, watching Leo's polished performance, he saw that version of his son, vulnerable human, had been replaced by a creature of angles and polish. Every word now carried an aftertaste of calculation. Sterling finally said something Arthur couldn't hear it, but he saw Leo laugh too loudly. That desperate laugh of someone afraid the silence might swallow him. Sterling smiled faintly, his eyes gliding past Leo toward Arthur for a split second. Recognition flickered there. He knew the name. Vance. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he wanted to see the man who had built something real before words like nexus and disruption meant anything. Arthur straightened his shoulders. His heart was steady. He hadn't come here to humiliate his son, but he also couldn't stand in the shadows and let his life's work be treated like a stepping stone in someone else's sales pitch. He glanced down at the tie Leo had given him, the shiny blue one that looked wrong under every light. He adjusted it carefully, smoothing it with deliberate calm, as if preparing for a photograph he didn't want but would endure. Then he took a slow breath and began walking toward them. The room seemed to shift, the hum of voices dulling to a low throb. Leo didn't notice at first. He was mid-sentence, still spinning his narrative of self-made brilliance. Sterling, however, did. His gaze moved from Leo to Arthur again, studying him with quiet curiosity. Arthur stopped just short of the circle, waiting for a natural pause. He didn't speak loudly, he didn't need to. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice calm but carrying, "I'm Arthur Vance. I think we might have some mutual history." "I'm not the dawn to the ration of this." Leo turned sharply, surprise flashing in his eyes, something between irritation and panic. Sterling extended his hand immediately. "Of course. I know your work. Your manufacturing systems were years ahead of their time." Arthur smiled slightly. "That's kind of you to say. We try to build things that lasted. Harder to do these days, I hear." Leo opened his mouth, perhaps to steer the conversation back toward himself. But Sterling's attention remained fixed on Arthur, and in that instant brief, unplanned Arthur realized he hadn't come forward to defend his legacy after all. He had come to reclaim his voice. Arthur closed the last few feet with a polite smile, the kind meant to soothe skittish animals and overconfident sons. "Leo, Mr. Sterling, hope I'm not interrupting." Leo's jaw tightened a fraction there and gone before he turned on his host's face again. Sterling offered his hand, grip dry and decisive, the kind of handshake that has signed more term sheets than most people sign birthday cards. Leo launched right back in, voice tuned to keynote pitch. "As I was saying, Nexus is anchored by our exclusive algorithm. We're not just optimizing routes, we're predicting demand before it exists. True anticipatory logistics. Imagine Target knowing it's out of stocks in Tulsa 12 hours early because Nexus sees the pattern at noon in Boise." He laughed, a bright, hollow sound, then added, "We're building what my father's generation could never conceive." Arthur let it pass. He looked at Sterling as if the two of them had all the time in the world. "Exclusive algorithm," he repeated mildly, as though rolling a coin across his knuckles. "That's fascinating, son. I'm curious, how are you handling data decay in a closed-loop system? You're training on your own predictions once they start feeding back, which means the noise amplifies if your confidence bands are too tight. Are you throttling with schedule reversion to ground truth signals, scan data, RFID reads, driver telematics, or are you letting the model self-correct on synthetic histories? And if you are, how are you preventing the cascade where latency turns bad data into policy?" A small silence opened clean, surgical. Leo blinked. It was the blink of a man who had walked onto a stage and discovered the script had been printed in Greek. Look. The point is, Nexus is future-proof. Our system is quantum-ready. So the usual constraints don't really... Quantum-ready, Sterling repeated, not unkindly. The way a teacher repeats photosynthesis to see if the student actually knows it. Interesting phrase. Arthur nodded as if conceding the marketing value. If you're talking quantum, your error correction will fight your throughput. So you'd only promise that to a board if you got a credible story for how you're going to manage decoherence across your loop, or you'll inflate the signal you think you're clarifying. In the meantime, on classical hardware, your real enemy is data drift. Anticipatory systems eat their own tail if you don't park guardrails around the feedback. We learned that the boring way forklifts idling Modesto because an intelligent reorder propagated a phantom rush out of Sacramento. He offered a small, apologetic shrug, as if to say, "The scars are free to take home." Around them, the air retuned. Conversations thinned within earshot. The woman in the sequin dress stopped mid-sip. A product guy in a skinny tie glanced over, suddenly attentive. Sterling took half a step closer, not to dominate, but to hear better. "That's a damn good question," he said, eyes on Arthur now. "How would you guardrail it?" Boringly, Arthur said, "You cap the algorithm's authority with a governance layer that can veto itself. You let the model propose, but force it to re-earn trust against live ground truths on rolling windows, say, 3 weeks, 3 months before it can widen autonomy. You make it prove it knows when it doesn't know, and you pay a human to tell it no on Fridays when the data looks weird." He smiled a little. "Also, you don't pretend that QPU is going to rescue a business problem that's really about trucks, weather, and people who call in sick." Leo laughed too loudly. "My father." He set a hand on Arthur's shoulder, an affectionate weight that applied pressure. "He gets lost in the weeds. Brilliant mind for the old ways, but this is next-gen stuff." He turned to Sterling with a practiced wind smile. "Dad, perhaps the buffet is more your speed?" It was soft as humiliations go, but soft humiliations travel farther. Arthur felt it land and pass through him like a draft under a door. He removed Leo's hand gently, as if returning a borrowed coat, and kept his eyes on Sterling. "You were saying?" he asked, inviting the older man to continue, as though Leo's aside had been a cough. Sterling did not look at Leo. "I was thinking about drift," he said, "and governance. We've seen platforms implode under the weight of their own predictions. Everyone promises foresight until the first holiday weekend breaks the model." "Memorial Day," Arthur said, and the two men smiled in mutual recognition of a battlefield. Inventory models hallucinate barbecues that aren't happening because the forecast ate last year's panic buying. You meter it with a human override, and you penalize the model for being confident and wrong. You treat humility like a KPI. IR, Leo tried again, a tremor under the polish. "We already do that internally. The team's been shipping governance updates every sprint." Sterling's eyebrow moved almost imperceptibly. "Which team?" Our data team." Leo's smile held too long. "We've got top talent. Former Axion, Meta, Tesla, you know the type." Arthur didn't take the bait or contradict him. He remained calm, almost kindly. "One more thing I'd watch," he said to Sterling, "is a geographic hysteresis when you do anticipatory preload. If you build a loop that moves pallets to where the model says demand will be, you'll starve the place it was. So you need to price the boredom what it costs to wait, which feels like heresy in a room like this." He glanced, just once, at the glittering crowd. "But waiting is a competitive advantage if you do it on purpose." Silence again, but this time it was respectful. Sterling's mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something like relief. "You sound like a man who counts trucks and not just charts." "I count people," Arthur said. "Trucks are how they get paid." Leo's face had thinned. "Mr. Sterling, obviously my father's experience is valuable. He built a solid regional operation in his day, but Nexus is a different animal. We're talking neural fields, not loading docks. My team has solved for decay with a proprietary approach, nothing I can disclose pre-NDA." He flashed teeth, happy to send a deck. "No," Sterling said mildly, eyes not leaving Arthur. "Decks come later." He paused. "How would you structure a pilot, Arthur?" Leo's head snapped. "We should schedule a formal pitch. Tomorrow. My calendar's—" "Pilot?" Sterling repeated, still addressing Arthur. "2 weeks, 1 market. Who do you choose, and what do you measure?" Arthur felt Leo stare like the heat from a lamp, but he didn't look. He answered as though they were discussing winterizing pipes. "Pick a city with honest weather and dishonest roads. Pittsburgh. You measure misses, you admit before the customer notices. You measure boredom, you budgeted inventory that sat where it should have, and you measure how fast your people can tell you the model is lying without getting punished." A even nodded. A soft exhale went around them, the collective sound of people recognizing a thing that makes sense. Sterling nodded once, decisive. He reached for a cocktail napkin and a pen the waiter produced as if by magic. "Write me the 3 metrics." Leo's voice pitched up, controlled but fraying. "Mr. Sterling, Nexus has already defined success criteria. We've—" "Later," Sterling said, the word gentle, almost grandfatherly, and devastating. He slid the pen toward Arthur. 3 metrics, he repeated. Humility, boredom, and what was the third? "Grace," Arthur said softly, "for the human who says the model's wrong." Sterling let out a short, delighted laugh. "God, I miss builders." He tapped the napkin. "Arthur, what do you think about this?" He gestured not to Leo's future, not to the chandelier room, but to the small, intensely practical universe of doing a thing right or not doing it at all. He did not look at Leo when he asked. He did not include him in the question. Leo stood there, hand half raised, as if still pushing his father toward the buffet, and then let it fall. The gesture abandoned mid-air like a joke no one laughed at. The balance had shifted so completely it didn't make noise. It simply rearranged the air. Arthur, who had come over to plant a small seed of truth, felt it take root in the most unlikely soil, not ego, not spectacle, but curiosity. Sterling waited, looking at him the way people look at a compass when their phones die. And Leo, for the first time all night, was nowhere in the conversation at all. The napkin with humility, boredom, grace, still lay between Arthur and Sterling, the ink drying like a quiet signature of mutual respect. Around them, the small crowd leaned in, drawn by the rare sight of genuine conversation in a room full of performances. Leo stood just outside the circle, smiling too tightly. He spent months building this night, designing every moment to orbit him. Now, impossibly, it orbited his father. Sterling wasn't merely humoring Arthur, he was engaged, nodding, laughing softly, even quoting him back. Every word between them pulled Leo further into the dark. Sterling tapped a napkin and said warmly, "You know, Vance, I haven't had a conversation this stimulating in years." The room heard admiration. Leo heard annihilation. He felt the blood rush to his face. The humiliation burned a sun reduced to a spectator at his own victory party. The sound around him blurred. His breath shortened. He tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "Mr. Sterling, if I could just..." But Sterling wasn't looking at him. Arthur said something about guardrails and human intuition, and Sterling chuckled, pleased. Leo's pulse thudded. He stepped forward, his hand finding his father's shoulder in a gesture that looked friendly but pressed too hard. "Dad," he said through a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "maybe let Mr. Sterling get back to the actual business talk. You're losing the room." Arthur's reply was gentle. "I think we're doing all right, son." That tone, steady, unhurried, snapped the final thread. Leo's voice rose before reason could catch it. "Shut up! Oh man, just shut up! You don't belong here! Go home!" The words detonated in the air. The jazz stopped mid-note. Glasses froze halfway to lips. A ripple of silence spread outward like a blast wave. Arthur didn't move. He simply stood there, eyes steady, face unreadable except for a faint sadness that softened everything around it. Sterling straightened slightly, his expression cooling. All around, people stared, some in shock, others in pity, all aware they had just witnessed something irreversible. Leo's hand dropped from his father's shoulder as though it had touched fire. He looked at Sterling, desperate to explain, but the man's gaze was fixed on Arthur. No one spoke. The silence itself was the verdict. Arthur adjusted his tie, the too bright one Leo had given him, and said quietly, "It's all right, Leo." But it wasn't. The words offered no forgiveness, only truth. The moment stretched, brittle, and airless. Then, faintly, a piano note returned, testing the room's balance. The party breathed again, but differently, careful, altered, aware. And in the center of it, Leo stood trembling, realizing too late that the only person who had truly belonged here was the man he just told to leave. The silence after Leo's outburst was so complete it seemed to hum. Sterling's expression, once cordial, now held the chill of marble. He looked at Leo for a fraction of a second, the kind of look that measures a man and finds him smaller than expected, and then moved. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, echoing just enough to remind everyone how loud quiet could be. Leo, still trembling, half stepped forward, lips parting as if to plead, but Sterling brushed past him as if he weren't there. The dismissal was absolute. He stopped before Arthur. The crowd, sensing something extraordinary, pressed closer in a hush of silk and glass. Sterling extended his hand. "Arthur Vance," he said, his voice carrying across the room, calm but commanding. "It's a true honor to finally meet you, sir. I've been following your work since your patent on microlattice processors. You changed the way the rest of us thought about scale." Gasps rippled. A few guests looked at one another, startled. Someone whispered, "That Arthur Vance?" Arthur took the offered hand, surprised but steady. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "that was a long time ago." "Good ideas don't expire," Sterling replied. Then he turned, addressing not Arthur now, but the entire audience, investors, founders, board members, journalists, all frozen in attention. "For those who don't know," he began, "tonight's gala was meant to honor the quiet giants of our industry. Our guest of honor wished to remain anonymous." He paused, smiling faintly toward Arthur. "Until now." A murmur of astonishment spread, polite but awed. Even the waitstaff paused, realizing they were witnessing something that would be retold tomorrow in every tech column in San Francisco. Cameras lifted, phones discreetly recording. Leo stood amid it all, blank-faced, his world rearranging in front of him. His father, the man he'd spent years dismissing as obsolete, was the guest of honor. The one Sterling had admired, the one he'd built this entire evening around. He had invited his father without knowing it, too blind with self-importance to see who Arthur Vance truly was, outside the narrow lens of his own ambition. Sterling looked back to Arthur. "You've turned down my invitations for almost a decade," he said with quiet admiration. "I wondered what it would take to get you in the same room." Arthur gave a modest smile. "Apparently, my son." The line broke the tension just enough for a few nervous chuckles. Then Sterling's gaze hardened again as he turned toward Leo. The warmth left his voice. "You just insulted our guest of honor," he said evenly, each syllable clean and final. "The deal's off. I don't do business with disrespectful people. You are a disgrace to your father's name." It wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The words hit like a gavel. A few guests turned away, embarrassed on Leo's behalf. Others stared openly, fascinated by the spectacle of poetic justice. Leo tried to speak some half-formed excuse, but nothing came. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, every whisper beginning to coil. The heat that had once fueled his arrogance now curdled into shame. Arthur, meanwhile, remained composed, though his eyes carried a deep melancholy. He hadn't wanted this. His dignity, once stripped, had been restored without a single word of his own. And yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like an ending. Sterling extended an arm toward the exit. "Arthur," he said, gentler now, "walk with me. I'd like to hear more about those governance frameworks of yours." Arthur hesitated only long enough to glance at Leo. The look was brief, almost tender, a mix of disappointment and something that still resembled love. Then he nodded and followed Sterling. As they crossed the room together, the crowd parted silently. No applause, no music, just the soft, respectful murmur of people making way for the kind of man they'd nearly forgotten existed. Leo remained where he was, under the harsh perfection of the chandeliers. The whispering around him swelled, then softened again, a tide of judgment disguised as pity. He realized his own voice, the one that had filled this room moments ago, was now gone, replaced by the echo of his father's name. When the doors closed behind Arthur and Sterling, the sound was almost tender, like the closing of a curtain. The performance was over, and Leo, surrounded by everything he'd built, stood alone in the wreckage of his own making. The morning after the gala arrived, gray and hushed, as if the city itself were embarrassed. Arthur woke early, habitually, and sat by the window of his apartment overlooking the harbor. He made coffee the way he always had, black, strong, no sugar, and turned on the news more out of reflex than curiosity. It took less than a minute before his name appeared. Legendary engineer Arthur Vance resurfaces at Sterling Foundation Gala. The article's tone was reverent, the photographs flattering. It praised his modesty, his timeless insight, his humble genius. Leo's name was nowhere to be found, not even in the captions. Arthur stared at the screen until the coffee went cold. He didn't feel vindicated. If anything, he felt the dull ache of someone who had won an argument he never wanted to have. He turned off the television. The silence that followed was thick and strangely personal. It reminded him of the years after the divorce, when Leo was still young, when Evelyn had filled their son's head with the idea that success meant shining brighter than everyone else. Arthur had tried to balance it with lessons about integrity, patience, humility. But Evelyn's version of ambition was easier to sell to a boy who liked applause. He could still see it clearly. Leo in high school, bragging about grades he hadn't earned, blaming a teacher when the lie fell apart. In college, taking credit for a group project he barely contributed to. "Everyone does it, Dad," he said. Arthur had sighed and let it go, telling himself youth was a phase that burned out. But it hadn't burned out, it had calcified. By noon, his phone began to buzz. Old colleagues, former partners, people who hadn't called in years. Some congratulated him, some wanted interviews, others simply said, "About your son, I'm sorry." By afternoon, the financial blogs had turned. Nexus Labs faces investor exodus after gala incident. Concerns mount over financial transparency. Arthur hadn't said a word publicly. He didn't need to. The world was doing the work for him. 2 days later, He spotted Leo by chance at a cafe near Union Square, a place where deals were made and careers were dissected over espresso. Arthur sat in a quiet corner, unread newspaper in hand. Leo was across the room, alone at a small table, phone to his ear. His suit looked slept in. Arthur watched him call an investor, his expression eager, then anxious. Across the room, a man glanced at the caller ID, frowned, and deliberately turned off his phone before slipping it into his jacket pocket. The gesture was small, merciless, and final. At the next table, two women leaned in, speaking just loud enough for Arthur to hear. "That's him, the Vance boy," one whispered. "The one who screamed at his father?" "At the Arthur Vance," the other replied. "Can you imagine?" They shook their heads, half appalled, half entertained. Arthur folded the newspaper to cover his face, though no one was looking at him. He felt no satisfaction, only the exhaustion that follows a long, preventable storm. Leo hung up, checked his phone again, then opened his laptop. Arthur saw the familiar panic in his movements, the frantic need to fix things that could no longer be fixed. Probably long, pleading emails to investors, explanations, excuses, promises, the kind of words people write when they still think reputation is repairable. Arthur turned away. He couldn't bear to watch his son flail in public. Pride and pity warred quietly inside him, neither strong enough to win. He knew the collapse wasn't really Sterling's doing. The gala had merely stripped away the illusion. Nexus had been crumbling for months, propped up by arrogance and wishful math. By evening, the story had spread beyond the business pages. Commentators dissected it as a modern Greek tragedy. Memes appeared. Clips of Leo shouting were spliced into motivational videos about humility. The internet was merciless in its efficiency. Arthur stayed home that night, watching the harbor lights blink on one by one. He thought about calling Leo, about saying something, anything, but the words refused to form. There was nothing to say that would not sound like judgment. Just after midnight, his phone rang. The caller ID read Evelyn. He hesitated, then answered. "Arthur." Her voice came sharp, trembling. "What have you done to our son? He's broken. You have to fix this." Arthur closed his eyes. Outside, fog rolled over the water like smoke. "I haven't done anything," he said quietly. "That's the problem." "Was?" Her breath hitched, somewhere between a sob and an accusation. "He's your son. Don't you care what happens to him?" "I do," he said. "That's why I'm not rushing in to save him this time." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was thicker than any argument they'd ever had. When the line finally went dead, Arthur sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city below. Somewhere, he knew, Evelyn was already on her way. And for the first time in years, Arthur felt the sense of something gathering, a confrontation not of his choosing, but inevitable, heading straight for him like weather. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? Arthur knew they were coming long before the knock. The warning came in the form of silence, the kind that expands in the house, that rearranges the air. He had been sitting in his living room, rereading an old technical journal without seeing the words when the faint sound of tires stopped outside. Then came the rhythm of Evelyn's heels on the front walk, quick and decisive, followed by the slower, heavier drag of another pair of feet. He stood, not because he wanted to, but because habit made him. When he opened the door, Evelyn didn't wait to be invited in. She swept past him in a navy coat that still smelled faintly of the expensive perfume she'd worn since their marriage. Leo trailed behind her, pale, unshaven, the collar of his jacket creased. His eyes barely met Arthur's. "Look what you've done," Evelyn said, not even waiting for the door to close. "Look at him, you and your damned principles. You couldn't just let him have his moment, could you? You always had to be the smartest man in the room." Arthur exhaled slowly. "Hello to you too, Evelyn." "Don't," she snapped, turning on him. "Don't you dare stand there acting calm. You humiliated him in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what people are saying? He can't show his face at his own office. And this one dude and their fracks. He did that himself," Arthur said quietly. Her voice rose. "You provoked him. You made him feel small. I didn't say anything, he interrupted. That was a problem. I didn't say anything for 30 years. Evelyn's mouth tightened, the lines of her face sharpening like cracks under pressure. Oh, here we go. The noble silence. The martyr act. She gestured toward Leo, who sat down heavily on the couch, elbows on his knees, face hidden in his hands. He's not you, Arthur. He never was. You can't mold everyone into your precious ideal. Arthur looked at his son, the slope of his shoulders, the familiar gesture of rubbing the bridge of his nose, and felt the tug of something that wasn't quite pity. I wasn't trying to mold him, he said. I was trying to give him a spine. Evelyn laughed, brittle and sharp. A spine? You broke him. You and that sanctimonious sense of justice. Always so sure you're right. Ozzy, Ozzy. Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy. Ozzy, Ozzy. Ozzy, 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 Ozzy. For a moment, Arthur saw not the furious woman in front of him, but the young Evelyn of decades ago standing in their kitchen with a realtor brochure in one hand, promising their son a better life, a bigger life. He remembered their arguments, him wanting to teach Leo to mow lawns for pocket money, her insisting that their son shouldn't smell like hard labor. You always said a boy should never see his mother cry, she said now, her voice trembling with fury. Well, congratulations. He's seen plenty this week. Arthur glanced at Leo again. Leo, he said softly, what do you think? Leo didn't look up. His fingers tightened together, whitening at the knuckles. The silence stretched so long that it began to hum. Evelyn answered for him. He thinks you owe him an apology. Arthur shook his head. I don't owe him that. What I owe him is honesty. And the truth is, I love him too much to pretend this isn't his fault. Evelyn's face hardened. You call that love? You've ruined him. He's lost everything, his company, his reputation, and you're still lecturing him. Do you even care what happens to your own son? I care, Arthur said, but I can't save him from consequences. Not this time. Her eyes glittered, cold and wet. Then I'll do it. I'll fix what you broke. I'll call Sterling myself if I have to. Arthur almost smiled sadly, wearily. He won't take your call. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice low and dangerous. Then you will. You'll call him. You'll apologize. You'll tell him Leo misspoke. I won't lie for him. She inhaled sharply, straightened her shoulders, and delivered her verdict. If you don't, Arthur, you'll lose him. Completely. Do you understand me? You'll never see your son again. The words hung between them, brittle as glass. Outside, a car alarm chirped once and fell silent. Arthur didn't move. He looked at Leo, his son, his blood still staring at the floor. Not defending, not denying, just waiting. Waiting for someone to fix his life again. Arthur finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Then I suppose I'll have to take that risk. Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came. She turned away first, clutching her coat tighter, as if against a sudden cold. You've changed, she said, her voice trembling now with something closer to grief. Arthur shook his head. No, I just stopped pretending. Leo stood slowly, his face pale and unreadable. He followed his mother to the door without a word. When the door shut behind them, the apartment was quiet again. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of an old wall clock filled the space. Arthur sank back into his chair, every muscle heavy. He knew the confrontation wasn't over. It was merely paused. Somewhere out there, Evelyn was already gathering her fury, and Leo, his lost, frightened son, was still her willing soldier. The next battle, he knew, would not be one he chose. But it was already on its way. Arthur didn't sleep after they left. He sat in the living room until the heat clicked off and the apartment cooled, the ticking clock refusing to rush anything. On the coffee table lay an old blueprint he'd pulled from a file years ago and never quite managed to throw away version 1 of a conveyor design sketched in pencil and coffee rings. He held it under the lamp like a relic and found the note in the margin he'd written to himself at 32. Test with hands first. It was the sort of instruction you gave when you still trusted your instincts more than a spreadsheet. He smiled, tired and real, and let the paper curl against his knee. Somewhere past midnight, he set aside the blueprint and opened the tin box of family photographs. Ellen in a flannel shirt, laughing in front of the first rented warehouse. Leo at 10, front teeth in the long, brave process of becoming permanent, holding up a lopsided birdhouse as if it were a moon landing. At dawn, he made coffee and a decision. He didn't draft statements. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call Sterling. He folded a sweatshirt into a bag, grabbed the old keyring that still held a brass tag stamped ELM Street, and drove out of the city while the red lights blinked sleepily over empty intersections. The freeway gave way to frontage road, then to the old industrial park where weeds did their quiet work against chain link fences. The building was exactly as he remembered, and not at all the paint more tired, the sign gone, the bay door scabbed with rust. The padlock gave after a stubborn minute. Inside, the air was cool and smelled like dust and varnish, a memory you could breathe. He turned on the lights in sections, listening to the hum stagger awake. The workbenches were still there, scarred and honest. The pegboard wall kept its geometry, chisels, clamps, squares, like a classroom that had been waiting patiently for summer to end. He ran his hand over the maple bench and felt where a knot had once surprised him, and the steady sandpaper had persuaded it to behave. Presence, he felt that. The simple fact of being exactly where his life had once made sense. The flashback didn't arrive as a scene so much as a texture. 10-year-old Leo, small hands braced clumsily on a block plane, Arthur's larger hands guiding the angle. Feel the grain, he'd said. It tells you which way it wants to go. Leo had grinned, shavings coiling like pale ribbon, and asked if wood could have a personality. It does, Arthur had said, because it was an easy kind of truth. You just don't get to bully it. The memory landed with a soft thud, like a board placed instead of dropped. He stood there longer than he meant to, letting it be both beautiful and a little broken. He pulled his phone from his pocket and typed the text without editing. I'll be at the old workshop on Elm Street all day. The door's open. He stared at the words. No atonement, no lecture, no trap. He hit send. The message left with a subdued whoosh that felt nearly ceremonial. Then he began to make the place ready, not for a performance, not for judgment, just for use. He swept sawdust that must have been older than several trends. He opened windows and let the cool air wrench out the stale. He checked the breaker for the old Powermatic lathe and coaxed it to life. The motor shuddered, then steadied into a low, loyal purr. He found a tin of linseed oil and rubbed a thin coat into a cutting board that had dried to a brittle stubbornness. He set 2 stools near the workbench and, without thinking, placed the good plane between them the way you'd set out a loaf of bread. The room settled around him. Hours passed in the agreeable way. Hours passed when you are doing something that doesn't pretend to be more than it is. Occasionally, his phone vibrated a news alert, an email from a reporter, a number he didn't recognize, but not the name he both dreaded and wanted. He left the phone face down on the bench. Every so often, he'd walk to the bay door and stand, listening for a car to slow, for footsteps in gravel, trucks drawn by to other destinies. A bird argued with itself in the rafters. By late afternoon, a rectangle of light had inched across the concrete to the base of the lathe. Arthur sat on the stool and let his hands find the old rhythms, test the edge, adjust the fence, take a shaving, just to see if he remembered how he did. He remembered he wasn't planning anything grand. Plans had become suspect lately. He was preparing a room where truth could breathe without choking on pride. If Leo came, there would be wood and tools and a door that did not lock behind him. If he didn't, there would still be the honest company of work. Arthur heard the car before he saw it, the low idol of a German engine misfit among the old warehouses. He didn't look up right away. He let the lathe wind down, the motor easing into a patient hush. Footsteps crunched across gravel, paused at the threshold, then entered with the faintest hitch, as if pride had to duck to clear the door. Leo stood there in his wrinkled suit, tie loosened, the shine scuffed from his shoes. He looked like a man who had dressed for a different story and walked into this one by mistake. He took in the light, the benches, the orderly swarm of tools on the pegboard. His jaw said, "Okay, I'm here," he said, voice too loud in the honest room. "What is this? Some kind of lecture? You want to show me what real work looks like before you cut me off for good?" Arthur flicked the switch to kill the last hum and nodded once, as if Leo had asked for a glass of water. "Door's open," he said. Hang your jacket if you want. No lecture, no trap. Leo left the jacket on, arms folded like armor. He wandered the perimeter instead, fingertips brushing the cool handles of chisels he once could name. He stopped at a shelf where a small, lopsided birdhouse crouched in the dust pine, crooked roof, paint long since dulled to chalk. He picked it up, thumb finding the same dent his smaller thumb had made years ago. You kept this, he said, softer. Didn't have the heart to throw away the moon landing, Arthur said, wiping his hands on a rag. Leo set the birdhouse down. He drifted to the main bench, to the maple scarred by years of corrections. A curl of wood shaving lay there like a pale ribbon. He rolled it between forefinger and thumb. Smells the same, he murmured, surprised by its varnish, dust, the faint sweetness of cut grain. The room pressed old feelings against his ribs. Saturday mornings in the too-big apron, Arthur's hands over his, the thrill of a long, clean peel lifting from the board like a secret revealed. You hungry? Arthur asked. There's a thermos. Coffee's not good, but it's coffee. Leo shook his head. The silence swelled, not empty, but weight-bearing. He paced once, then stopped as if he reached the end of a thought. Arthur laid the rag down. Are you happy, Leo? The question landed with the accuracy of a carpenter's pencil mark. Leo's mouth twitched. Is this a trick? No. A bead, then another. Leo looked at the floor. I was supposed to be, he said. That's the deal, right? You win, you're happy. He let out a small, humorless sound. I haven't slept since the gala. Investors won't pick up. People stare in cafes. Mom, he swallowed. I keep thinking if I can just explain. It'll reverse. Like a bad trade you can unwind if you move fast enough. Arthur waited. Leo's shoulders sank a fraction. You know what I remember? He said. Not the patents, not the factory. The way you read purchase orders out loud, like prayers. The way the guys on the floor said your name and you answered from the mezzanine like you were one of them. He glanced up, then away, and I remember hating it. Hating feeling small next to all this. He gestured at the room. I thought if I made something shinier, I wouldn't feel like a shadow. His voice thinned. So I lie sometimes. And when I didn't lie, I edited. I told myself I was selling the future. You were selling certainty, Arthur said. Without heat, it's more expensive. Leo flinched as if struck, though the tone had been flat. I thought if I walked into a room and people felt me if they said my name, if the deck looked perfect, that it would make the fear shut up. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. It never shut up. They stood in it, the mission and the air. Outside, a truck downshifted, then growled away. Dust hung briefly in a shaft of sun, and then settled as if deciding to stay. I'm angry at you, Leo said finally. And the honesty in it made him sound younger, not crueler. Because you make it look easy. You stand there and people listen. You didn't even try. You just asked a question and everything tilted. Arthur considered. It's never been easy, he said. I just learned where to put the weight. Leo huffed. And I learned how to perform. His eyes found the birdhouse again. And then, at the gala, I didn't perform. I showed what I am. You showed what you are afraid you are, Arthur said. That's different. Leo stared at him. Some small held thing in his face loosened. I don't know how to fix it. Neither do I, Arthur said. Not like a switch, but I know how to start. How? The word was unguarded. Arthur reached under the bench and pulled out a straight-grained offcut of maple and the old block plane with the cherry knob worn smooth. He set both on the bench between them, then stepped back, palms open as if to show there was no trick. Start with this, he said. With your hands. Make it smooth. Our heaven nah. Leo gave a half laugh that almost broke. That's it? You want me to whittle my way out of public disgrace? I want you to learn how to feel again, Arthur said. This will fight you if you bully it. It will teach you if you listen. There's a right direction and a wrong one, and you don't get to decide which is which. The board does. Leo looked at the plane like a relic, then gripped it too tightly, then corrected himself. He set the sole on the edge and pushed. The blade chattered, caught, tore. He winced. Arthur said nothing. Leo adjusted, tried again. The second pass gave up a thin curl, imperfect, but promising. It fell to the bench and coiled against his knuckle. He held still, surprised by how light it was. Arthur watched, not hovering, not instructing. Present the way a wall is present. You feel it, you lean on it if you need to. It doesn't tell you what to do. Leo drew another shaving breath, sinking with emotion. The room made its old music. Wood, tool, man. After a while, Leo said, quietly, if I don't get the deal back, if Nexus dies, what am I then? A man, Arthur said. Possibly a better one. Leo nodded, barely. He looked at the board, at the growing ribbon of smoothness revealing itself under the torn spots. He lifted the plane once more, steadier now. Arthur didn't call it forgiveness. He didn't call it anything. He slid the spare stool closer with his foot and stood aside. Start with this, he repeated. And the lesson sat between them, simple as grain. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking, like, or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? Spring came quietly to Elm Street. The cold that once clung to the windows of the old carpentry shop had softened, replaced by the smell of varnish, sawdust, and something else renewal. Leo arrived each morning before 8. He no longer wore suits. The first few weeks, he came in expensive sneakers and button-down shirts, until he realized it was impossible to plan wood without rolling up your sleeves. Now, his clothes were as plain as his father's. Denim, flannel, calloused hands that finally looked like they belonged to the work. He was still clumsy, still impatient. He missed cupboards, split edges, and once nearly sanded through a piece that had taken him a week to measure. But he stayed. That was the miracle. He stayed, cursing softly under his breath, then starting again. Arthur never praised him outright, but now and then he'd pass by, glance at Leo's work, and nod almost imperceptibly. Leo learned that a nod from his father was worth more than a round of applause from an auditorium. Weeks folded into months, and the workshop began to sound like the world's oldest duet. The rhythmic scrape of planes, the hum of saws, the pause of two men thinking differently but toward the same goal. Leo's motions became surer, less showy. He stopped trying to impress. He started trying to understand. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them was no longer awkward, it was a shared rhythm. When Arthur broke it, it was usually practical. Check your grain direction. That's a quarter-inch off. Simple, grounded. Yet behind every correction was something softer, a trust forming where pride had once lived. One afternoon, as Leo rubbed finish into a small side table, his phone buzzed on the workbench. The screen lit up with his mother's name. He hesitated, wiped his hands, and answered. Leo? Evelyn's voice was sharp, urgent, the same blend of worry and accusation that had filled his childhood. Are you still with him, Arthur? You've been there for months, for God's sake. What are you even doing? He glanced toward his father, who was bent over a blueprint, pencil tucked behind his ear. I'm working, Mom, Leo said simply. Working? For what? You had a company, Leo. You had a future. I still do, he said. He looked down at his hands, sawdust lining the creases. Just a different kind. Leo, I'm busy, he said, his tone calm, not cruel. I'll call you another time. And for the first time in his life, he hung up first. Arthur looked up briefly. Everything all right? Leo smiled faintly. Yeah, he said. I think so. And thus to Pal. That night, after closing up, Leo lingered by the blueprint table. It was covered with sketches and measurements, most of them Arthur's precision without decoration. But on one corner, Leo had added something of his own, a small modular frame designed to make heavy workbenches adjustable for older craftsmen or wheelchair users. He hesitated before speaking. Dad, he said, what if we built something like this? Something practical, affordable, for community workshops, maybe partner with a few trade schools? Arthur walked over, picked up the paper, and studied it. It's good, he said after a pause. You have to reinforce here, or the load will bow the base. I know, Leo said. I was thinking aluminum brackets, lighter but strong. Arthur handed him a pencil. Show me. They stood side by side, sketching and crossing out, erasing and redrawing. At some point, Arthur reached for the coffee thermos and poured them both a cup. It was burned and bitter, but Leo drank it anyway, smiling faintly. They stayed at that table long after the daylight died, the workshop lit only by the lamp that made the air shimmer with gold dust. By summer, the prototype stood against the wall, a sturdy, adjustable table that worked beautifully, though not perfectly. They both knew they'd spent months refining it, but perfection wasn't the point anymore. The process was, one afternoon, Arthur rolled up the new blueprint and clipped it to the board above his bench. The name written across the top was simple: Vance and Son. Leo stared at it for a long moment. "You sure about that name?" he asked quietly. Arthur nodded. "It's not a company yet, just a start. Foundations matter more than names." They stood shoulder to shoulder, the faint hum of a radio somewhere under the sound of the lathe. Arthur placed his hand on his son's shoulder, not to guide, not to correct, but to stand beside him. Leo didn't say, "Thank you," and Arthur didn't say, "I forgive you." They didn't have to. The air between them was full enough with effort, with peace, with sawdust and second chances. Outside, the light softened against the windows. Inside, two men leaned over a single table, marking the future in pencil, erasable, adaptable, but real. For the first time, they were building the same thing.